Hello, Wendy. So happy to have you here on Justice Matters.
It's great to be with you, Diego. So good to see you.
Thank you. For our listeners, I first met Wendy when I was starting at the Kennedy School, and this incredible history of being the chief negotiator with Iran on the nuclear negotiations, with North Korea, history of doing political affairs as a State Department, and I just felt so lucky and in awe to have an amazing teacher. And to me, this is a very special episode because as I was kind of leaning towards my future more into doing rights-based work and social justice, it was you who took a chance on me at TPL, and being here 6 years later, just really feels a little surreal. So in many ways, you've been one of my mentors, one of the people that have helped me make my way through life. So thank you so much, and I'm so happy to have you with us to discuss this very important topic.
Well, I'm so excited that you have been doing what you have been doing, Diego. You were a student leader when you were here for LGBTQI rights. And I'm so thrilled that you found a pathway to help people all around the world to have their rights, to have freedom. It's a tough arena, tougher in today's U.S. domestic politics. But I know you're a great leader, and so I'm delighted to be here with you this morning.
Thank you so much, Wendy. So let's dive into it. Really, one of the things that I wanted to talk to you most about was your experience speaking with leaders around the world about LGBTQ rights, especially when you were Deputy Secretary of State under President Biden just now. In 2023, Uganda passed the anti-homosexuality bill, a draconian bill, criminalized with the death penalty, just being married to a gay person, married to a person of the same sex, being in a gay marriage. It criminalized even having a book with gay characters in your house. It criminalized a landlord having someone who identified as gay living in one of their properties. Just draconian measures. And I know that you talked to leaders like Museveni and others around the Middle East on these issues. And so my first question is, you talk to these leaders about a lot of things. When you bring up this topic, is it different? Is it more difficult? Where does the conversation go when this is brought up?
So I actually spoke with Museveni about this when I was the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, the first time that this law looked like it might move forward. So the good news is it took more years for it to happen than I thought at the time. And, what I usually hear from leaders, I've talked to Putin about this as well, and what I hear from leaders mostly is, I don't care personally, but I'm worried about my children, and I don't want people to bend where my children or the children of my community go. That is, of course, an argument that, in my view, does not stand, and I've pushed back. I think that there are a lot of religious and cultural norms around the world that make this difficult. Museveni even said to me at the time, well, I think we once had a king who was that way. And I met with some LGBTQI folks at the time. This was many years ago, probably around 2014. And they had to be very careful and very quiet. And the good news is that I think things have begun to change over time. I remember as deputy going and meeting with community leaders in India, and we had a normal meeting, whereas I would say probably 5 years earlier, we would not have had a public meeting. So I see some positive change, but it's pretty tough, and we can see that in our own country now as well.
Yeah. So I wonder if you've ever felt that there are some people who are more amenable in private perhaps, about this
Sure.
topic? And then in public, totally awful. And
Of course. I would even expect that President Trump privately doesn't care. But publicly, and for his MAGA followers, LGBTQI and particularly transgender rights have become anathema. And he sees that it works to get people whipped up, and so he goes for it. But I would suspect that in private, he doesn't much care.
And so that makes me curious about perhaps what the different strategies could be about interacting with these leaders if perhaps the issue isn't as high profile but still important. Maybe if you've seen personal stories, work with diplomats around the world, it doesn't have to be high-level leaders but diplomats, or what kind of approaches have you seen, or maybe listening from civil society leaders?
Yeah, so it's very different in different countries. In some countries, I mean, I always made it a point as deputy secretary to meet with the community. Sometimes that had to be done in secret because folks were really worried for their safety. But it was important to have that secret meeting because it validated who they were and what they were fighting for, if quietly and cautiously and step by step. In other places, I remember in Japan, meeting with a group from the community, and I did a brief podcast with them, very public, very open, small group, but really growing. When I was undersecretary for political affairs, I went to Nepal and met with the community, and Nepal was, I think, the first country where your passport could be male, female, or other. And I met with the two people who were the first others. And Nepal, which is a Buddhist community and Buddhist country, very tolerant, had really paved the way long before most countries had. And I was very proud that in the Biden administration, Secretary Blinken announced that we would have a passport that was similar. President Trump, of course, has changed that policy.
So it's always so interesting for me to think about you doing all these secret meetings around the world with these activists. I mean, I'm in constant contact with a lot of them, but I just imagine what it would mean to have the president, to have the United States, and have the president's administration actually meeting with these activists. It must have been a lot. And also, of course, the State Department put a very strong special envoy for LGBTQ rights in Jessica Stern, who did incredible work. So I was wondering what kind of strategy or values also went into the foreign policy of the Biden administration in that sense.
Well, you know, there's all this debate now about DEI and wokeness. And Pete Buttigieg, I think, said it best. The opposite of diversity is sort of nothingness. The opposite of inclusion is exclusion, and people don't want to exclude other people. And the opposite of equity is inequity, which we shouldn't believe in. So I think that what we all have to focus on is not necessarily elevating one person's rights over another, which I think people really don't feel comfortable with, a lot of people, but to in fact say everyone's rights should be protected. None above the others, but inclusion is absolutely essential. And equity of opportunity is what America is all about. It's not a guarantee of success, but at least it is equal opportunity. And ensuring that we hear lots of different voices, because you make better foreign policy when you hear from everyone, and that means everyone along the political spectrum, everyone who chooses how they're going to live their lives, their ethnicity, their race, their religion. All of that really deepens and enriches the decisions one makes.
And I also, in maybe just to take it into a personal space, I'm an immigrant, and I grew up closeted, mostly because my parents came from a conservative country and they were very conservative. In coming to the United States allowed me to be myself, to come out, because there was more freedom here. But I always thought about all of the people in the closet suffering silently, maybe for their whole lives, in that silence they're drowning in. And how proud I was to see the administration put the equality of LGBTQ people, their dignity, their mental health, their basic human right to live as a main value in that. So it resonated with me because I knew and had suffered some of that growing up, that this was a priority for the United States. And the fact that it can be dismissed as somehow DEI or something that isn't central to just human dignity and our values is deeply hurtful, and people are going to feel that effect as well. So, but thank you for that and your leadership during that time and speaking up.
Yeah, it's very interesting. President Trump's Secretary of Treasury is gay.
Yeah.
Rich Grinnell, who is an envoy for him, is gay. So clearly the president understands that being gay does not undermine your ability to be a productive, important player in the world. And I think it's important to help people understand that he has embraced people who are gay, and my guess is there are others in the administration that perhaps are not out or as public as both the Secretary of Treasury and Ambassador Grinnell are. But it's important for people to know those facts, to know that even President Trump, who is going after DEI as if it is something evil, has embraced people who are gay.
One of the ideas that we have been researching here in our program are the myths that a lot of the populist far-right movements have been spreading around the world, and this is both in the U.S. and outside the U.S. The main three really are that being LGBTQ is somehow not normal, and that's something that they try to propagate. And that has certain dimensions to it. One, that somehow propaganda or being exposed to this could make young people more likely, which I'm telling you, there are LGBTQ people all over the world, whether you have any TV shows or not with gay characters. And there's always been through history. Museveni even said there was a king that was like that. And then, of course, the second part of it is that it can somehow be fixed or changed. And so then these egregious so-called conversion therapies that sometimes are like torture for people.
Absolutely.
Or violence. And then lastly, that somehow this will lead to total decay of society. So, I seen these leaders in the way they speak really use that to amp up their popular support. I wonder if they truly believe it, especially these leaders have been all over the world and seen thriving LGBTQ people in places where they have been given their rights. So I wonder what you think about how we combat those myths, the right activists, but also people who are in diplomacy and even take into account the fact that there are all these high-level officials in the Trump administration now that maybe could speak up for that those myths are wrong and dangerous. So I don't know, the conflation of the myths, the politics. I wonder how you, and also just the fact that the cultural and religious differences is something you take into account in diplomacy. How do you try to balance those conversations?
Well, as I said, some of those conversations are private and quiet because countries are at a place where their religious heritage or cultural heritage really means not only do you not talk about someone who's gay, you don't talk about sex.
Yeah.
You don't talk about gender. Um, those just are not topics of conversation in the religious and cultural history of some countries. So what you want to do is, what I tried to do was meet with the community, even if secretly, to validate them, to take whatever mini steps they could to quietly change the cultural and religious norms. It takes time, but we know in our own country it took a long time for people to be able to marry, and then it seemed like overnight it occurred. It really wasn't overnight. The actual flipping of the switch happened overnight, but it was probably a decade's worth of work that got to that place. So I think it's understanding that you start where people are and you try to help them move step by step to the dignity that every human being deserves.
That totally resonates. In fact, that's a lot of the conversations we have in our program with the activists, a lot of whom are a little impatient too to meet people where they are sometimes, and justifiably so after so many years of oppression. And that does, and I'm glad the diplomats are working in this space, because even just asking people what they think and offering an antithesis, right? They could say, "Oh, I'm worried about the children in my country."
Yes.
It says, well, maybe you should be worried also about the LGBTQ children in your country suffering as well.
Yes.
You know, so I'm glad there is a space for at least leaders, even if they can't right away act on it because the popular support isn't there, to have an understanding of that, I think is important.
Absolutely. I think your point about very young people and their suffering because they cannot come out, they don't feel validated for who they are, is terribly important. There's a lot of discussion now about the Netflix program Adolescence, which I've watched.
Me too.
It's
It's
powerful
raw,
and
yeah.
raw and hard, but it's really about how social media puts all kinds of profiles of what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman, and undermines the ability of people to be who they are and validate who they are. And I think that programs like Adolescence, as raw as it is, helps to engage in discussion in the broader community, for people to understand that whether it is the rules of a country or the social media that young people watch, that we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and it opens up the eyes of generations that didn't grow up with that social media presence. What is getting to younger people? It scares me too of thinking of these spaces where younger people are also exposed to ideas of ostracizing LGBTQ people, of spreading these myths that somehow we're not normal, especially trans people, that trans people are somehow an ideology, not just diversity of gender identity. And so we need to be vigilant. That show actually made me realize just how we're failing in many ways in understanding the effect of that in young people. So I want to shift a little bit more into global politics and kind of this struggle that we've seen norms-wise between a Western-style liberal democracy and this Russian-style illiberal democracy. There have been, over the past couple of years, a lot of countries in the Sahel area, specifically in Africa, who have turned their back on France and the U.S., who were their go-to partners. And Russian-backed groups, Russia itself, has kind of moved in as trying to be the hegemon in that area as well. With that have come also terrible anti-LGBTQ bills. In Ghana, we saw a bill, which is the model democracy many times in that part of the world, saw a bill pass through its Congress, although it wasn't signed, and it's kind of making its way through the legislature again. And in Uganda, of course, that the bill passed in 2023, and what they're trying to export is a new model of governance that comes a lot of times with the idea of draconian laws for LGBTQ people. In fact, there's a reporting from the Wall Street Journal that in March 2023, a few months before the Uganda bill was passed, Russia gave $300,000 to a group to host an anti-LGBTQ conference. And so we see the connections very clearly. And there is a Russian-aligned think tank that has a demographics group, which has bots that does misinformation on LGBTQ people all over the world. So I wonder how you think about this connection between LGBTQ rights now becoming a tool of destabilizing countries and of hegemonic kind of competition, because in this polarized world, that means that has very difficult consequences for LGBTQ people.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we see that happening here in the United States, where LGBTQ rights are being used as a cultural emblem of things that people don't want. And I think the election of President Trump, I personally think it was pretty impossible for any Democratic candidate to win because the country wanted change. And a lot of people in our country felt disempowered by economic shifts and rapid social change. That guy in the Midwest who thought those two women down the street were really nice, but now they could get married. When did that happen? People who were moving into his neighborhood were brown and they went to a mosque. When did that happen? He didn't have his manufacturing job anymore. His wife had to go to work, which hadn't been their deal. So I think economic issues were paramount here, but so were social cultural issues. And unfortunately and horribly, LGBTQ rights are being used as an emblem of that rapid social change, and to say that we should turn that back. So what you're seeing in West Africa, what you're seeing in Russia or Hungary or other places in Uganda is about trying to say, we are not them. We are normal. We are powerful, because they aren't part of our lives anymore. And it is terrifying. I do want to hasten to say that part of what happened in West Africa and Mali and other places, really, I think, we have not dealt well, and I don't think Europeans have dealt well with the history of colonization. And I think that, quite frankly, France might have taken a different approach to former colonies than they did, so that we didn't get to a point where, whether it was the Central African Republic or Mali or Niger, felt they had to kick everybody out of the country and find a different path and a different sponsor who might let them be whoever they wanted to be. And the Wagner troops took over, terrorists have taken over. It's really become no man's land in many ways now, which is dangerous and problematic in its own right, but without a doubt, what you're saying is correct, Diego, which is that LGBTQI rights have become emblematic of we don't want to be them, we want to be us. As if you are gay, somehow you aren't us. In my view, we're all us.
And that puts the U.S. in a little bit of a bind, because as much as we want to advocate for the rights of LGBTQ people, they're kind of putting us in a trap 22 where they say, oh, that's because it's a Western agenda. And that's what they're trying to bring to you, when in fact you're trying to elevate the voices that are suffering in silence in the country and with the activists. So, what do you think strategically and this might be a hard question, but for both activists, but diplomats and people working in this space, is a good strategy to try to maneuver that trap and try to actually make progress on this issue without strengthening those narratives that there is one side and the other, and one embraces LGBTQ rights and the other doesn't?
So I would say activists in communities where they're being pushed down and held back need to decide for themselves how best to go forward. It's not like there's one strategy that works everywhere in the world. And some activists are willing to put their lives on the line for what they believe. Others want to take a more measured, step-by-step approach because they want to keep themselves and their loved ones safe. So I admire whatever strategy people in the communities themselves feel most comfortable pursuing. I think Diego, I was originally trained as a social worker,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the tenets of social work is that you begin where people are. And in some communities, in some countries, where people are is they want to create a community of others who are gay, quietly and secretly, just to validate themselves and quietly build their strategy and their community to a point where they can create real change in their country's norms and values and laws. Others want to be out there in the streets, even at great risk. And I really want to be, and want our diplomats to be, wherever the people themselves want to be. I don't think it's our decision, my decision, when I was Deputy Secretary of State, to decide for others how they wanted to proceed to gain the rights that were due them.
That's, a very strong message, because a lot of times that is the criticism that the U.S. has gotten, that they don't listen to where people are. So I'm glad to hear that too. And I do think LGBTQ people, they find safe spaces for themselves. Making that possible in any way the U.S. could is, I think, helps. And then eventually they find their voice, their organizations, and they start doing the work, trying to keeping them safe. I think in our view of things from our program, for example, is one of the best things the U.S. could do. Another question that comes up, especially thinking about the strategic use of Twitter and other social media apps for sowing discord in democracies during elections, by Russia specifically and others. How can maybe the U.S. but also activists kind of sound the alarm, or what is a good strategy to say before we get riled up in this discussion? Let's just see why this discussion is being riled up and whether the division it causes is worth the pain. Because just as an example, when the issue of LGBTQ rights came up, I think in the EU and the Council of Europe, that was one of the most contentious meeting they had. And so raising the stakes, raising the rhetoric on this makes it harder for democracies to work together. And it is destabilizing at the end of the day. So what is good foreign policy to try for leaders in these countries to try to tone down maybe the heat of these conversations, and to actually realize that they're playing into the hands of people trying to stabilize them?
Well, I think, again, each situation is sui generis. It's not like there's one size that fits all. And sometimes parliaments, councils need to have a contentious conversation to put issues out on the table and to get a real conversation going. Sometimes the contentious conversations are counterproductive. But I think that people in those parliaments, in those legislatures, in those countries, in those councils who are fighting for those rights probably have the best fingertips for knowing whether to pursue a tough conversation or to hold back. And I think the one other thing I should have said earlier is, in communities where it's very tough, not only should LGBTQ activists find each other, but find other human rights advocates and align with them. There are many human rights advocates in countries, also quietly, trying to encourage human rights and to make sure that when they're doing that activism, they're including LGBTQI rights as well.
And that's exactly also what we kind of teach. So it makes after organizations start building, finding allies, and then hopefully start moving to hearts and minds work, which is very difficult. But I like it when the models and the frameworks fit the contemporaneous conversation.
Yes, so. Sure.
And so just to now start closing thinking in the U.S., I'm really interested in this idea that you brought about managing and communicating effectively on the pace of change. A lot of times, in a lot of the most popular classes actually at the Kennedy School, deal with leadership, managing losses, people's losses in different ways that change brings. Not only the extent of those losses, but how fast they come. And on this U.S. election conversation, that was also very fascinating to hear that, there's been a lot of that people want change, and at the same time they're reacting to a lot of change. So how do you see, especially for trans people being so attacked in the United States, a domestic conversation, leadership in this space, as both the community as a whole tries to navigate attacks against these folks, while also trying to build inroads with communities and allies and win new hearts and minds as we move forward as a country?
So I think that the Trump administration, President Trump, have used trans rights as a method of creating fear. You and I both know the number of trans people in this country is not very large. Number of trans people in sports is incredibly small. But it is to say, these people are so deviant, I know I'm normal. And it is a way for people to feel more secure about themselves, to say, I'm not them. And so I think that our first responsibility is to keep and do whatever we can to ensure that trans people are safe. Because I worry very much about violence against trans people, and particularly around trans kids, and about kids who are transitioning being able to continue to get the treatments that they need. I've talked to some endocrinologists here in Massachusetts, and lots of people are flocking to Massachusetts from states where families cannot get the support for their children that they want. And we're not talking about 13-year-olds having surgery. We're talking about 13-year-olds getting hormone therapy. And yes, it's a difficult decision, but I have more than one friend who has a trans child. And those children really, really, really need the support of their parents to be who they are and to feel comfortable with who they are. And for schools to be able to support those children, just like you would support a child who might be bullied for other reasons, maybe because they have buck teeth or because they don't do well in physical education and they can't play football and they like to draw instead of play soccer. So you want to work with teacher associations to make sure that teachers everywhere support children, whatever and whoever those children are. So my first concern for trans people is safety, and we have to do everything we can to ensure their safety and ensure that children who are going through a transition, whether it's transition of coming out as a gay person or transition to be a trans person, have all the support they need. And then we will have to quietly and constantly work for the rights of trans people as adults to live their lives in safety until we get past this terrible time where trans people are being used as a way to say, I'm normal because I'm not them. They are us. We're all different.
Yeah. You know, I've always said Americans know what discrimination is. We've studied it. We know it in our history. We're ashamed of a lot of it. But always discrimination when it's happening and we don't have the foresight of seeing what kind of arguments will be made. It is nestled in these myths, in these things that make the issue so-called complicated, right? Somehow that being trans isn't normal, or that it's some kind of ideology like communism to defeat, when we know that there has been trans people all over history.
Absolutely.
There was a Roman emperor called Elagabalus who wanted to be called lady, who actually sought doctors to try to have medical interventions. And of course it wasn't easy to be out in those times, but we have evidence of that. So trans people have always been here, and it just happens that we're living through a moment where sexual orientation and gender identity diversity is better understood. And there's always been discrimination against that. We
Absolutely.
Are in a reckoning moment. And I think as Americans know discrimination, and we just need to see it very plainly that it's that, in the same way that discrimination for a host of other things were argued, trying to muddy the waters and whatnot. It's just simple. There's diversity of this, and some people are treated very harshly just because they were born this way. And
Absolutely.
And it's devastating. And then just lastly, I want to say I came out during the Obama administration. It was a big part of it was feeling like my country was validating me. Mm-hmm. A big part of seeing a president say that we should be, there was an HRC dinner, the Human Rights Campaign dinner, that President Obama said, somewhere there is a little boy in his bed thinking that he may not have a future with his authentic self. And that was me watching on YouTube. Mm. It really changed my life. And that's why I actually became a community organizer with the Human Rights Campaign afterwards. And so it matters. The leadership matters. The way we talk about this matters. And it hurts me to think about the messages getting to young folks, especially young trans folks at this time. So, well, Wendy, I want to thank you for being with us here in Justice Matters. Thank you for being first for everything that for your mentorship, and remember you also helped me prepare for my debate for student body president back in the day. And it's just such a pleasure to be able to connect with you doing the work and just admiring you from afar, all the amazing work you're doing on the Biden administration and also in awe of everything you did before that. So thank you so much.
Well, Diego, it's been a pleasure. And, I'm of an age where I'm passing the baton. And I'm so glad that there are leaders like you who have taken up that baton and are doing the activism and the leadership that's necessary to ensure that every single human being on this earth can live with dignity and freedom and equality. So thank you for what you do, and thank you for your program.
Thank you. Thank you.